Welcome to the Folktale Project. This is Dan Scholz. Today we have a story that is all about devotion, and, well, it's a bit of a Rip Van Winkle tale. This is the Monk of Heisterbach. In olden times, in a lovely valley near the Seven Mountains, stood a cloister called Heisterbach. Even now, parts of the walls of this old monastery remain, and it was not by the hand of time, but by the barbarism of foolish warfare, that its halls fell into ruins. The monks were driven away, the abbey was pulled down, and the stones were used for the building of a fortress. Since that time, so the country folk relate, the spirits of the banished monks wander nightly among the ruins, raising mute accusations against their persecutors and the destroyers of their cells. Among them there was one, Gebhard, the last prior of Heisterbach, who now, they say, wanders about the graves of the monks and also haunts the burial places of the masters of Lowenberg and Drachenberg. In the Middle Ages, the monks of Heisterbach were very famous. Many a rare copy of the Holy Scriptures, many a learned piece of writing was sent out into the world from this hermitage, telling of the industry and learning of the pious monks. There was one brother, still young in years, who distinguished himself by his learning. He was looked up to by all the other brethren, and even the gray-haired Father Prior had recourse to his stores of knowledge. But the poisonous worm of doubt began to gnaw at his soul. The mirror of his faith was blurred by his deep meditations. His keen eye would often wander over the faded parchment on which the living word of God was written, while his childlike believing heart, humbly submitting itself, would lamentingly cry out, "Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief." Like a ghost, his restless doubts would hover about him, making his soul the scene of tormenting struggle. One night, with flushed face, he had been meditating over a parchment. At daybreak, he still remained engrossed in his thoughts. The morning sun threw his bright rays over the heavens, casting playful beams on the written roll in the monk's hands. But he saw them not. His thoughts were wholly taken up by a passage which for months past had ever been hidden to him, and had been the constant subject of his reflections. 1,000 years are but as a day in thy sight. His brain had already long tormented itself over the obscure words of the psalmist, and with a great effort he had striven to blot it out of his memory. And now the words danced again before his weary eyes, growing larger and larger. Those confusing black signs seemed to become a sneering doubt hovering round him. 1,000 years are but as a day in thy sight. He tore himself away from the silent cell, seeking the cool solitude of the cloister gardens. There, with a heavy heart, he paced the paths, torturing himself with horrid doubts. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his mind was far away from the peaceful garden, and without being aware of what he was doing, he left the cloister gardens and wandered out into the neighboring forest. The birds in the trees greeted him cordially. The flowers opened their eyes at his approach. But the wretched man heard and saw nothing but the words, 1,000 years are but a day in thy sight. His wandering steps grew feeble, his feverish brain weary from want of sleep. Then the monk sat down on a stone and laid his troubled head against a tree. A sweet, peaceful dream stole over his spirit. He found himself in spheres glowing with light. The waters of eternity were rushing round the throne of the Most High. Creation appeared and praised his works, and heaven extolled their glory, from the worm in the dust, which no earthly being has been able to create, to the eagle soaring above the heights of the earth. From the grain of sand of the seashore to the gigantic crater which at the Lord's command vomits fire out of its throat which has been closed for thousands of years. They all spoke with one voice, which was not heard by the haughty, being only manifest and comprehensible to the humble. These were the words of him who created them, be it in 6 days or in 6,000 years. 1,000 years are but as a day in thy sight. With a slight shudder, the monk opened his eyes. I believe, Lord. Help thou my unbelief, murmured he, taking heart. The bells sounded in the distance. They were ringing for vespers. Sunset was already gleaming through the forest. The monk hastily turned towards the cloister. The chapel was lighted up, and through the half-open door he could see the brothers in their stalls. He hurried noiselessly to his place, but to his astonishment he found that another monk was there. He touched him lightly on the shoulder, and strange to tell, the man he saw was unknown to him. The brothers, now one and now another, raised their heads and looked in silent questioning at the newcomer. A peculiar feeling seized the poor monk, who saw only strange faces round him. Growing pale, he waited till the singing was over. Confused questions seemed to pass along the rows. The prior, a dignified old man with snow-white hair, approached. "What is your name, strange brother?" asked he in a gentle, kind tone. The monk was filled with dismay. "Maurice," murmured he in a trembling voice. "St. Bernard was the abbot who received my vows in the 6th year of the reign of King Conrad, whom they called the Frank." Incredulous astonishment was depicted on the brothers' countenances. The monk raised his face to the old prior and confessed to him how he had wandered out in the early morning into the cloister gardens, and how he had fallen asleep in the forest and had not wakened till the bell for vespers sounded. The prior made a sign to one of the brothers. Then, turning to the monk, he said, "It is almost 300 years since the death of St. Bernard and of Conrad, whom they called the Frank." The cloister annals were brought, and it was there found that 300 years had passed since the days of St. Bernard. The prior also read the following note. "A doubter disappeared one day from the cloister, and no one ever knew what became of him." A shudder ran through the monk's limbs. This was he, this brother Maurice, who had now come back to the cloister after 300 years. What the prior had read sounded in his ears as if it were the trumpet of the last judgment. 300 years! With wide open eyes he gazed before him, then stretched forth his hands as if seeking for help. The brothers supported him, observing him at the same time with secret dismay. His face had become ashy pale, like that of a dying person. The narrow circle of hair on his head had become snow white. "My brothers," murmured he in a dying voice, "value the imperishable word of the Lord at all times, and never try to fathom what he in his wisdom has veiled from us. May my example never be blotted out of your memory. Only today the words of the psalmist were revealed to me. 1,000 years are but as a day in thy sight. May he have mercy on me, a poor sinner." He sank lifeless to the ground, and the brothers, greatly moved, repeated the prayers for the dead over his body. And that is the story of the Monk of Heisterbach. A tale of, well, faith, and how important it is, and how if you don't have it, apparently you'll wander into a forest where you'll sleep for 300 years. Until you realize that you should have just had faith to begin with. This is Dan Scholz for the Folktale Project. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, anywhere you like to get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at Folktale Project. You can find us on Auto Radio, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, anywhere you'd like to listen. And you can always head over to folktaleproject.com, where you'll find a new story waiting for you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. As always, thank you so much for listening.